Hulk Hogan pointed across the room and shouted, "Let's see what you can do in a real ring." Everyone thought it would be a joke, a show, just another aging celebrity trying to go viral. But when the royal guard stepped onto the mat, removed his tunic without saying a word, and stood face to face with the icon who once called himself immortal, nobody laughed. Because what happened next wasn't wrestling, wasn't for cameras. And it wasn't a fight either, it was a lesson. And by the time Hogan hit the mat for the third time, even he couldn't tell where the show ended and the silence began. So before we reveal the difference between performative brawling and the quiet discipline of a soldier trained to end things without a sound, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what happened next shocked everyone outside that ring. The invitation to the Wellington Club charity event had seemed straightforward enough when Captain Rhys Alton received it 3 days earlier. A quiet midweek gathering for transatlantic unity through sport, hosted in one of Westminster's more discreet venues. The guest list read like a diplomatic who's who: retired military officers, embassy staff, a handful of Commonwealth representatives, and some American cultural figures thrown in for balance. Rhys hadn't particularly wanted to attend. He'd only returned from a training rotation the previous week and was technically still on leave. But when the Coldstream Guard's liaison officer personally requested his presence in full ceremonial dress, he'd agreed without question. 20 years of service had taught him that sometimes duty meant standing in uncomfortable places for reasons that wouldn't become clear until later. Just ceremonial presence, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell had explained over the phone. Nothing formal required. The Americans requested authentic British military representation, and your record makes you ideal for diplomatic settings. What she hadn't mentioned was that Rhys's record included 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 classified rotations with 22 SAS, and a Distinguished Conduct Medal he wasn't allowed to discuss publicly. To most observers, he was simply a guardsman in dress uniform. To those who knew how to read between the lines, he represented something considerably more substantial. The call had come with an unusual addendum. "One more thing, Rhys," Mitchell had said, her tone shifting slightly. "There may be some colourful personalities in attendance, American entertainment industry types. Just maintain standard protocol regardless of provocation." At the time, he'd assumed she meant typical celebrity behaviour. Perhaps someone wanting photos or asking inappropriate questions about security procedures. He certainly hadn't expected what actually awaited him. He arrived at the Wellington Club precisely 10 minutes early, as military habit demanded, his scarlet tunic immaculate and bearskin positioned with parade ground precision. The venue itself was understated, polished oak panels, subdued lighting, the kind of place where serious conversations happened away from public scrutiny. No press had been invited, no cameras allowed beyond the entrance, just a gathering of people who understood the value of discretion. The security arrangements were more thorough than typical charity events. Embassy personnel had screened the guest list twice, and several unmarked protection officers mingled discreetly among the attendees. Someone, Rhys realised, was taking this cultural exchange very seriously indeed. What Rhys hadn't expected was to find Hulk Hogan holding court near the refreshment table. The 70-year-old wrestling icon commanded attention simply by existing in the space, bandana slightly askew, handlebar moustache still bleached platinum, wearing a shirt that seemed optimistically sized for his still broad but aging frame. Even in civilian clothes, Hogan carried himself with the performative confidence of someone accustomed to arenas full of cheering crowds. "Special guest edition," Dr. Margaret Hensley, the event coordinator, whispered to Rhys as he took his assigned position near the main entrance. "Something about American entertainment industry contributions to international relations. Honestly, we were expecting someone from the film industry." She looked genuinely flustered, consulting her tablet repeatedly. "His agent confirmed this morning, said it was all arranged through State Department Cultural Affairs. I've been trying to verify the details, but..." Rhys nodded politely, though privately he wondered how professional wrestling qualified as cultural diplomacy. Still, stranger things had happened in the name of international cooperation. He'd once stood guard while a folk dancing troupe performed for visiting dignitaries from 3 different countries that were technically still at war with each other. Within 30 minutes of the event's official start, Hogan had effectively taken over the reception. His voice carried across the room as he regaled a growing circle of guests with stories from his wrestling career, punctuated by observations about British customs that ranged from amusing to mildly condescending. "You know, back in the States, we appreciate our military a little differently," Hogan was saying to a group that included 2 retired RAF officers and a diplomat from the Canadian High Commission. "More hands-on, if you know what I mean. Less standing around in fancy outfits." The Canadian diplomat, Elizabeth Morrison, who'd served 2 tours as a military attaché and held a master's degree in international security studies, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Beside her, Wing Commander Peter Hayes, who'd flown combat missions over Kosovo and Afghanistan, exchanged a meaningful glance with his colleague. "Our ceremonial units serve an important diplomatic function," Morrison finally said, her tone remaining politely professional. "Tradition and pageantry have their place in international relations." Sure, Hogan replied dismissively. "But when push comes to shove, you need people who can actually fight, not just march in parades." Hayes cleared his throat. "I think you might be surprised by the capabilities of our ceremonial troops, Mr. Hogan. Selection standards are quite rigorous." Across the room, Colonel Andrew Trafford, recently retired from the Royal Marines and now serving as a Ministry of Defence liaison, was deep in conversation with the American military attaché when he overheard Hogan's commentary. His expression darkened slightly. "Problem?" asked the attaché, a sharp-eyed woman named Colonel Jennifer Nash, who'd spent her career in special operations. "Potentially," Trafford murmured. "That guard over there, Captain Alton, has a background that might make this evening more interesting than intended if our wrestling friend continues down this path." Colonel Nash followed his gaze to where Rhys stood in perfect stillness. "What kind of background?" "The kind that doesn't appear on public service records," Trafford replied cryptically. That's when Hogan noticed Rhys. "Now that's what I'm talking about," Hogan announced, his voice cutting through the polite conversation like a wrestling announcer's microphone. "Look at this guy over here. Is this what you call a soldier? Or is he some kind of museum piece?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through the nearby guests. Morrison and Hayes immediately stopped their conversation, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Rhys maintained his position, eyes forward, expression unchanged. Years of ceremonial duty had taught him to ignore provocations far more creative than this. During his last posting at Buckingham Palace, he'd endured everything from drunk tourists attempting to make him laugh to protesters trying to provoke reactions for social media content. But this felt different. There was something deliberately testing about Hogan's approach, as if he were probing for weakness rather than simply entertaining the crowd. "Seriously, folks," Hogan continued, stepping closer to Rhys with the confident swagger of someone used to commanding attention. "This is what passes for military readiness over here. Guy looks like he'd fall over in a stiff breeze." The laughter grew more strained. Several guests began shifting uncomfortably, sensing that the tone was moving beyond good-natured ribbing into something more pointed. Near the back of the room, Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, a decorated veteran attending as part of the US Embassy security detail, stopped mid-conversation and turned to watch. Williams had served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, earning a Bronze Star and Purple Heart before transitioning to diplomatic security. She recognized the signs of escalating confrontation and began quietly positioning herself for better observation and potential intervention if necessary. "I trained with real fighters," Hogan continued, flexing slightly for emphasis. "Guys who could actually handle themselves in a real situation, not whatever this costume party represents." Hensley began moving through the crowd, her diplomatic instincts screaming warnings. She'd organized dozens of international events and knew how quickly cultural misunderstandings could spiral into diplomatic incidents. Rhys turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Hogan's presence, but remained silent. Protocol was clear about engaging with civilians during ceremonial duties, and nothing in Hogan's behavior suggested a genuine threat requiring response. Yet something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Colonel Trafford had begun moving through the crowd, his military bearing cutting through clusters of conversation with quiet authority. Behind him, Colonel Nash was speaking quietly into a small communication device. "Oh, we're doing the strong, silent type?" Hogan grinned, playing to his impromptu audience. "That's cute. Tell you what, soldier boy, how about we settle this properly? Get ourselves a little demonstration going, see if all that fancy uniform training translates to actual capability." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from an unwanted cigarette. Conversations around the room began to die away as more guests became aware of the developing situation. Wing Commander Hayes stepped forward, his RAF training kicking in. "Mr. Hogan, perhaps we could discuss military traditions over dinner instead. I think you'd find our service members' experiences quite fascinating." "I'm sure I would," Hogan replied, but his attention remained fixed on Rhys. "But right now, I'm more interested in seeing some actual demonstration of capability." Before anyone could respond further, Hogan had somehow acquired a wireless microphone from the club's sound system and was addressing the entire gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've got ourselves an opportunity for some real cultural exchange here. How about we see what these famous British guards can actually do when they're not standing around looking decorative?" The challenge was now public, witnessed by dozens of guests representing multiple governments and institutions. Master Sergeant Williams moved closer, her experienced eye noting the subtle tension in Rhys's posture. Not stress, but the kind of readiness that preceded action. Elizabeth Morrison immediately began calculating diplomatic consequences. A confrontation between an American celebrity and a British serviceman, regardless of outcome, would require careful management to prevent international embarrassment for both nations. Colonel Trafford reached the scene as murmurs spread through the crowd. "Mr. Hogan," he said with diplomatic firmness, "perhaps we could discuss this privately." "Nothing private about it, Colonel," Hogan replied, clearly relishing the attention. "I'm just suggesting a friendly demonstration between allies." "What's wrong with that?" "What's wrong," Trafford said quietly, "is that you don't understand what you're asking for." Hogan laughed. "Come on, Colonel. You're telling me this parade ground soldier is going to surprise me?" Trafford approached Rhys with military directness. "Captain Alton," he said quietly, "you're under no obligation to engage with this." "Understood, sir," Rhys replied, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that came from years of making decisions under pressure. "However," Trafford continued, his tone measured, "there are State Department observers present tonight, as well as representatives from several Commonwealth nations. Whatever happens here will be analysed through diplomatic channels." Colonel Nash approached from the opposite side, having finished her communication. "Captain," she said quietly, "I've just briefed Embassy Security. Whatever you decide, you'll have full support from the American side. This wasn't sanctioned or approved through proper channels." Rhys recognised the tactical situation immediately. Refusing would be seen as weakness, potentially reflecting poorly on British military capability. Engaging carried risks of its own, but controlled engagement might actually serve diplomatic purposes better than avoidance. More importantly, he'd begun to understand that this wasn't a random celebrity outburst. The timing, the setup, the presence of so many official observers, someone wanted this confrontation to happen. Dr. Hensley reappeared at his side, her diplomatic composure strained. "Captain, I want to emphasize that this is completely inappropriate. If you'd prefer to leave, we can arrange—" "That won't be necessary," Rhys interrupted politely. "Mr. Hogan seems intent on some form of demonstration. Perhaps we can accommodate him." The decision made, events moved quickly. Club staff cleared a space in the main hall and produced exercise mats, typically used for the venue's wellness programs. The makeshift area wasn't much, perhaps 20 feet square, bordered by hastily arranged chairs, but it served the purpose. Dr. Hensley found herself coordinating what felt like an international incident disguised as entertainment. "This needs to be documented properly," she muttered to her assistant. "Official observers only, no social media, complete discretion." As Rhys began removing his ceremonial tunic with practiced efficiency, folding each piece with parade ground precision, he noticed the subtle change in crowd dynamics. The casual chatter had died away, replaced by the focused attention of people sensing they were about to witness something significant. Master Sergeant Williams had positioned herself near Colonel Trafford, both military professionals, recognizing that this impromptu demonstration would likely reveal more about British military training than anyone expected. "What's his background?" Williams asked quietly. "More than appears on his service summary," Trafford replied cryptically. "Guards regiment selections aren't made lightly." Colonel Nash joined them, her expression professional but concerned. "This has the feeling of a setup. Someone wanted this to happen." "My thought exactly," Trafford agreed. "Question is whether Captain Alton realizes it." Near the back of the room, retired Brigadier James Whitmore, who'd commanded special operations units for 15 years, studied Rhys with growing interest. Something about the young captain's movement patterns suggested advanced tactical training, the kind typically reserved for specialist units. "Interesting," he murmured to his companion, a former SIS officer named David Sterling. "That's not standard ceremonial training." Sterling, whose career had involved assessing military capabilities for intelligence purposes, nodded slowly. "No, it certainly isn't. Question is what Mr. Hogan thinks he's getting himself into." Hogan, meanwhile, had embraced the moment with theatrical enthusiasm, stretching and flexing for his impromptu audience, while maintaining a steady stream of commentary about American athletic superiority and British ceremonial pretensions. "See, what Americans understand," he announced while performing exaggerated warm-up exercises, "is that real strength comes from real training, not parade ground marching and standing at attention." Several of the military officers in attendance exchanged glances. Wing Commander Hayes leaned toward Morrison. "This is going to be educational for someone. I'm just not sure who." Standing in his white undershirt and formal trousers, Rhys presented a markedly different figure than his ceremonial appearance suggested. His frame was lean but clearly conditioned, with the wiry strength that came from functional training rather than aesthetic pursuits. Small scars traced across his forearms, subtle reminders of operational experience that few civilians would recognize or understand. "Jesus," Master Sergeant Williams whispered to Colonel Nash. "Look at his muscle definition. That's not ceremonial training." The crowd had arranged itself in a rough semicircle around the improvised ring, with military personnel instinctively positioning themselves for optimal observation angles. Dr. Hensley stood nearby with her tablet, frantically typing notes that would later become an official incident report. "Finally," Hogan announced into his microphone, "let's see what you've actually got under all that costume jewellery." Rhys stepped onto the mats without fanfare, his expression unchanged, his movements economical and purposeful. No warm-up routine, no psychological preparation, just the quiet readiness of someone accustomed to transitioning rapidly from routine to action. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to trained observers. The ceremonial guardsman had been replaced by something else entirely, not theatrical or aggressive, but carrying the focused calm that experienced operators recognized immediately. Brigadier Whitmore leaned forward in his chair. "That's combat stance," he said quietly to Sterling, "modified for close quarters." Dr. Hensley approached the edge of the improvised ring, stopwatch in hand, clearly hoping to maintain some semblance of control over the proceedings. "Gentlemen, this is meant to be a brief, friendly demonstration." "Don't worry, sweetheart," Hogan interrupted, removing his bandana with a flourish. "I'll go easy on him." The comment drew a few chuckles from the crowd, but the laughter felt forced now, driven more by social obligation than genuine amusement. Master Sergeant Williams noticed several embassy security personnel had quietly positioned themselves around the room's perimeter, not to intervene, but to observe and report. Colonel Nash was speaking quietly into her communication device again. "Embassy security, this is Nash. We have a developing situation at the Wellington Club. Maintain observation protocols. No intervention unless specifically requested." Rhys positioned himself in the center of the mat space, hands at his sides, posture upright but relaxed. To untrained eyes, he might have appeared unprepared, even vulnerable. But Colonel Trafford, watching from the crowd's edge, recognized the stance immediately. The controlled readiness that preceded operational action. "This is either going to be very quick or very embarrassing," Trafford murmured to Williams. "For who?" she replied. "That," said Colonel Nash, "is exactly what I'm worried about." Dr. Hensley gave a reluctant nod, and the demonstration began. Hogan moved first, his approach aggressive but telegraphed. The kind of showy charge that played well in entertainment venues but revealed more about showmanship than tactical thinking. Despite his age, he retained considerable size and strength, his advance carrying the momentum of decades of staged confrontations. Rhys shifted almost imperceptibly, a single lateral step that transformed Hogan's direct approach into a grasping at empty air. The movement was so minimal, so precisely timed, that several spectators initially thought Hogan had simply misjudged his target. "Lucky dodge," Hogan muttered, resetting his position with less confidence than before. Brigadier Whitmore leaned forward, recognition dawning. "That wasn't luck," he said quietly to Sterling. "That was spatial awareness training." "Advanced spatial awareness," Sterling corrected, "the kind they teach in Hereford." Hogan's second attempt involved more technique. A feinted approach followed by a lunge designed to close distance and initiate grappling. In the wrestling entertainment world, such moves typically led to extended sequences of back-and-forth action designed to build crowd excitement. Rhys responded with textbook efficiency. As Hogan committed to his lunge, Rhys stepped inside the movement, used the wrestler's momentum against him, and applied a standing joint manipulation that brought Hogan to one knee without apparent effort. The technique was executed with clinical precision, enough pressure to control, not enough to injure. The hold lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Rhys released it and stepped back, allowing Hogan to regain his footing. The crowd's reaction was notably different now, less laughter, more focused attention. Even guests with no military background could recognize the clinical precision of what they'd just witnessed. "Jesus!" Master Sergeant Williams whispered. "Where did they find this guy?" Colonel Nash was already on her radio again. "Embassy security, update your assessment. This is not a typical ceremonial guard." Elizabeth Morrison, who'd been quietly observing from the diplomatic section, began mentally drafting the report she'd need to file with her superiors. This was no longer a simple cultural event. Hogan stood more slowly this time, his theatrical confidence replaced by something approaching genuine assessment. He looked around the room, perhaps for the first time noticing the intense focus of the military observers. "Okay, that was clever," he said, but his voice had lost its performative quality. "Let's try this again." But his third approach carried more urgency, less showmanship. The playful mockery had been replaced by something closer to actual competitive intent, the kind of escalation that turned demonstrations into genuine confrontations. Wing Commander Hayes stepped forward slightly. "Perhaps that's sufficient demonstration." "No," Hogan cut him off, his eyes never leaving Rhys. "I want to see what he's really got." Rhys met this escalation with proportional response. When Hogan attempted a more aggressive grappling technique, he found himself on the mat again, this time held in a position that made further movement inadvisable without risking injury. The hold was perfectly applied, professional, controlled, designed to immobilize rather than harm. But everyone present could see that Rhys could have applied significantly more force if necessary. The room had gone completely silent. Even the club staff had stopped moving. "Enough," Rhys said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the now silent hall. Hogan tapped the mat twice, the universal signal of submission. Rhys released him immediately and stepped back, offering a hand to help the older man to his feet. The gesture was courteous but not condescending, professional rather than personal. As Hogan accepted the assistance, his expression had transformed completely. The bombastic entertainer had been replaced by someone reassessing both the situation and his assumptions about it. "Well," he said, his voice notably quieter than before, "I guess they don't just teach you how to stand around after all." The comment wasn't quite an apology, but it carried an acknowledgement that hadn't been present earlier. Rhys nodded slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both acceptance and dismissal of the entire episode. He began retrieving his uniform components, dressing with the same methodical precision he'd shown in removing them. The crowd's response was measured, polite applause that felt more like recognition than celebration. Several military veterans in attendance offered subtle nods of approval, understanding what they'd witnessed in ways that transcended the evening's entertainment value. Brigadier Whitmore approached Colonel Trafford with obvious curiosity. "That young man has specialist training. Where's he really from? Officially? Coldstream Guards, ceremonial duties," Trafford replied. "Unofficially, his file has some interesting gaps." 22 SAS, Sterling asked quietly. Can't confirm or deny, Trafford said with a slight smile. But let's just say his current posting isn't his first operational assignment. Colonel Trafford approached, as Rhys finished adjusting his tunic buttons. Well handled, Captain. Minimum necessary force, professional restraint, diplomatic sensitivity maintained. Thank you, sir, Rhys replied, positioning his bearskin with parade ground precision. Master Sergeant Williams joined them, her expression one of professional respect. Captain, I don't know what your background is, but that was expertly done. You've probably prevented a diplomatic incident while maintaining unit honour. Just doing my job, Sergeant, Rhys replied simply. Hogan, meanwhile, had been unusually quiet during the aftermath, accepting a towel from club staff and speaking in low tones with members of his entourage. When he finally approached Rhys, his demeanour carried none of the earlier bravado. I owe you an apology, he said simply. I came in here thinking I knew what I was looking at. I was wrong. Rhys studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Apology accepted. Mind if I ask where you learned to do that? Various places, Rhys replied, his tone polite but unrevealing. Military training covers many eventualities. Hogan smiled ruefully. I bet it does. He extended his hand. Thank you for not making me look like a complete fool. That wasn't my intention, Rhys said, shaking the offered hand. I know, Hogan replied. That's what makes it worse. You could have really hurt me, couldn't you? Rhys considered the question carefully. Mr. Hogan, what happened here was a demonstration. If this had been a real situation, the outcome would have been very different. The understatement sent a chill through the nearby observers. Dr. Hensley, who had watched the entire exchange with barely concealed anxiety, now approached with visible relief. I think we can consider this evening's cultural exchange complete, she announced diplomatically. But Colonel Nash had other concerns. She approached Dr. Hensley with military directness. We need to discuss how this event was arranged. There are questions about the guest list approval process. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, the incident's details spread through whispered conversations and discreet text messages. No official recording existed. Phones had been secured at the entrance. But descriptions of what had occurred began circulating through diplomatic and military channels. Master Sergeant Williams found herself fielding questions from several American attendees who wanted to understand what they'd witnessed. That wasn't typical ceremonial guard training, she explained. That was something else entirely. Elizabeth Morrison was already on the phone with her superiors in Ottawa, explaining why her routine cultural event report would require additional security classifications. The next morning, Hogan posted a brief statement on his social media. Respect where it's due, met a real professional last night. Some traditions earn their reputation. The post generated significant attention, though without context, most followers could only speculate about its meaning. Military and diplomatic personnel who read it, however, understood perfectly. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from confusion to admiration. Several military accounts added their own cryptic responses, suggesting they understood more about the context than Hogan's civilian followers. But it was the response from an account verified as belonging to a serving US Navy SEAL that caught the most attention. Some people wear dress uniforms, others earn them. Captain Rhys Alton never commented publicly about the evening. He returned to his regular duties the following day, his routine unchanged, his demeanour unaffected by the previous night's events. But among his fellow guardsmen, the story spread with the quiet respect reserved for those who uphold unit honour under unexpected circumstances. Not through violence or humiliation, but through the kind of disciplined professionalism that defined their service. Dr. Hensley, in her after-action report to the Ministry of Defence, noted that Captain Alton had demonstrated exemplary restraint and tactical awareness in managing an unplanned civilian confrontation. She recommended that his response be studied as a model for similar future incidents. Her report also included pointed questions about how Hogan had gained access to the event and whether his confrontational behaviour had been intentionally orchestrated for unknown purposes. The Wellington Club quietly updated its event protocols to include more thorough guest coordination and clearer guidelines for handling unexpected situations. The evening's charitable goals had been achieved, but the real education had come from an unscripted demonstration of what true strength looked like when properly disciplined. What struck most observers, looking back, wasn't the physical techniques Captain Alton had employed, impressive as they were, but his restraint in using them. He'd applied exactly the force necessary to end each confrontation without injury or humiliation, then immediately de-escalated. That level of control, witnesses realized, represented something far more sophisticated than entertainment wrestling or competitive martial arts. It reflected training designed for environments where the consequences of poor judgment could extend far beyond personal embarrassment. In the weeks that followed, the incident became something of a case study in military diplomatic circles. An example of how traditional military bearing and modern operational skills could complement each other in unexpected contexts. For Hogan, the evening marked a rare moment of genuine surprise in a career built on carefully orchestrated spectacle. He'd entered expecting to encounter ceremonial pageantry and had instead met quiet professionalism of a type he hadn't previously experienced. The encounter left him with a new appreciation for the difference between performance strength and functional capability, a distinction he hadn't fully understood before finding himself on the wrong side of it. 3 weeks later, Hogan would quietly make a substantial donation to a British military charity with a note that simply read, "For the professionals who serve without recognition." Captain Alton, characteristically, treated the entire episode as simply another aspect of his duties. He'd represented his unit and his service with honour, maintained operational security, and resolved a potentially diplomatic incident without escalation. In his view, that was exactly what he'd been trained to do. The fact that he'd done it while wearing ceremonial dress only proved that the uniform's significance extended far beyond its symbolic value. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have seen past Hogan's celebrity status to recognise when entertainment crossed into disrespect? Or would you, like many in that room, have been caught off guard by how quickly things escalated? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story opened your eyes to what really lies beneath those ceremonial uniforms, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the truth behind tradition, and hit that bell icon to never miss an upload. Check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another powerful story that proves respect is always earned, never given.